So I wanted to say something quickly to Shirad, just about, I didn't send this off to everybody, but this article from that quotes Professor Friedman. I told you I could talk. I just want to tell you very quickly. This is an interesting thing. There was this theory that's put forth by this professor of biblical studies. Who I think I told Shira. I never met him, but I knew. In, I think it might have been his brother-in-law. Somebody who knew him very personally told me about another one of his theories, and I do put them in a little bit of quotes. In this particular theory, he wanted to put forth that the Beit HaMikdash was not destroyed by the Babylonians, but rather by the Edomites. And what I want to say, I'm not going to go into it now, but if you want, I can talk to you about it in greater detail. My first reaction when I saw it is, everybody knows these psukim. There's nothing new here. We know. I think, and I didn't even go back to look it up because I was busy with other things. I'm pretty sure that the understanding is that the Edomites were a client state of the Babylonians. The Babylonians were the dominant empire, and I believe I think that's how some of the Rishonim understand the way these things get put together. But what I want to say, this is one of the issues I have with certain aspects of biblical criticism. You can bring to bear proof from texts that don't exist. In other words, what he says is it must be that the sofer who copied this particular text, he skipped a line, and this is and he sort of mixes and matches things to fit his theory. It would be a lot more convincing if there was some other proof for that. In other words, if there was some archaeological evidence, then maybe I understand. But even then, the fact that the Edomites may have been the ones who actually burned down the Beit HaMikdash doesn't mean that the Babylonians weren't in charge. And just like I would say, if you have, let's say in the British Empire, they also had, let's say in India, they had the Indian Army do a bunch of things under them. So let's say the Indians did X in Kashmir. I'm just making something up. It doesn't mean that it wasn't the British Empire that did it. But it could be that the particular army that they used that was under them was the Indian Army. And I think it's the same thing there. If I have time, I'll try to give you a more detailed answer. But I just in general, one of the reasons, one of the reasons that I decided at a very young age that I prefer to learn in yeshiva rather than in a university setting. I have nothing against you learning about Tanakh in a university setting. In fact, I almost did a doctorate in Tanakh at McGill. But as you see, I think from the style of this shiur, I'm interested in understanding the texts as they present themselves. And I understand that every text that we have is going to have, to some degree, it's going to be influenced by its own time and its own place and things like that. It's not, to whatever degree I can understand that and bring that to bear, then I'll do that. But I'm not necessarily, and I will even look at alternate Girsaot, look at different versions of the text that are extant. I'm not going to be willing to make up a text or to edit a text to fit my theory. I have to take what's given to me. So that was kind of my objection to this. The other thing that I heard that he said, and this was definitely secondhand, so I don't know exactly how he said it, but he wanted to say that in Uva L'Tzion, we call Kiddusha de Sidura, right, that we say every day in davening, the idea that we do Kadosh, 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 and then we do the Targum, and then we do, right, Baruch Hashem Yimkamo and Hashem Yimachol Am Voed. So there's this, there are three psukim that are attesting to essentially the same idea, that the angels are constantly praising Hashem. They praise Hashem every day. So he said, but the reason they do it in three, that the reason that was incorporated into Kiddush Sidura, that was like a response to the idea of the Christian Trinity. So I'll tell you. So the thing that irked me about that, and again, I have other very interesting academic research about other things that do seem to be in response to Christianity. This one seems to be very rachok, because Kiddush Sidur, as far as we can tell, was made up in Babylonia I think in the 3rd century, where if there were Christians there were very few, and they were not the dominant culture. It's not something that Jews would have probably consciously felt that they had to push back against. So my impression of him from these two things is that he likes to stir things up, but without a lot of proof. It's just like, I can make this fit or I can make that fit, but I don't think it really teaches us anything.
Okay, that's I agree 100%. But my question was: is there an elder text and a discussion in the earlier rabbinic literature, perhaps, about these tensions, about this question?
Yeah. So that. Okay, we lost Shira. Let's wait for a moment.
Shirley?
It's a little bit complicated. That was my question.
I'm sorry, wait. Shira, we lost you for about a minute.
Yeah, sorry, my mic, the connection is a little bit weak today. I apologize for this, but so it's in Germany. I repeat it. So my question was not so, frequent is not so important. My question was about early discussion in rabbinic literature about the tension between this Psukim and Yirmiyahu and the books of King, and that was my question. So
okay,
perhaps you have some hint from
the go-to place, the first place you should look, and this is where I believe I remember seeing this idea that the Edomites were a client state. The best place to go first is to look at the Radak. The Radak was very sensitive to all these issues. Sometimes Rashi talks about them, sometimes Ibn Ezra talks about them. The Radak generally is more comprehensive. He's intimately familiar, like all these Rishonim are, with the different passages, and he will also bring in Chazal. He'll also he'll bring in the Chazal's explanation. Sometimes he'll agree with it, sometimes he'll disagree with it in terms of pshat, but this is one of the things. It's kind of interesting, and I know this from talking to people who have studied biblical criticism on an academic level. The ones I know who have some kind of like a yeshiva background, they understand that these are questions, that biblical critics are not the first people to ask these questions. Chazal asked these questions, and all the Mefarshim asked these questions. I'm pretty sure on those things also, the Abarbanel, I think, will also address the Abarbanel. Look first in the Radak, because the Abarbanel also looked in the Radak. He saw the Radak. And then much later on, like the Malbim. All of these people address these issues. And maybe you like their answer, maybe you don't like their answer, but you know.
Okay.
So I mean, I'm coming from this kind of traditional point of view in that regard. I'm very open to new ideas and new ways of looking at things, but I do draw a line at saying that well, the Sofer must have made a mistake and therefore we should read it like this instead of this. Now, some of the people who do that in biblical criticism, what they're doing is they're looking at the different Targumim, both the Aramaic Targumim, the Syriac Targum, the Septuagint, and some of the very early Targumim. Based on the way things are translated, they will sometimes offer a theory that they had a different text in front of them, a slightly modified text. And there's a much stronger basis to say that. And we know that when it comes to learning Torah, Torah is different in this regard than the rest of Nach. There are variants in the Torah, but there are far fewer variants in the text of the Torah because it was considered to be so sacred, and of course it was copied many more times because there are always Sifrei Torah being copied. And in Nach, there are many more variants. So in modern times, there's still people who work on that. In the last generation, there was Rav Mordechai Breuer, who in his lifetime published three separate editions of Tanakh, because in his lifetime, he would change his mind about different aspects of the text based on new evidence or based on new thing. And he developed his own theory of how one should decide what is the correct text. But he was certainly very aware that there are many variants. And you will see also, we even came across this when we were looking at Tehillim, that Rishonim had variant texts in a lot of these texts. And yes, those things we should all be actually very sensitive to, because they're not as cut and dried. So like the Rambam held the Keter Aram Sova, the Aleppo Codex, is in the highest esteem. He thought it was the most reliable text of the Tanakh. And he says this, actually did this in my other shir on Thursday night in Sofrut. He says this in Hilchot Tfilin Mezuzah Sefer Torah in Perek Chet. He mentions it. He doesn't call it the Keter Aram Sova because in his time it was still in North Africa, but he saw it. Later on, it got to Aleppo. It got to Aleppo and eventually got here. And there's a whole interesting book which I haven't read, but I read a summary. There was a book that was written a few years ago about the history of the Aleppo Codex and what happened to it, especially since 1948. Anyway, this is what the Masoretes dedicated themselves to over centuries. And for somebody to come along and say, well, the Sofer made a mistake, you don't do that unless you have some very good reason, not just to fit into a particular theory that you might have. Because yes, Sofrim did make mistakes, or yes, Sofrim thought that they might have been correcting something where they shouldn't have corrected it, and vice versa. Yes, those things happened, but people dedicated themselves over centuries to observing those things and trying to codify them and winnow through them and read out what the best text is. So one should be, shouldn't be flippant about those things. But yes, in terms of his particular theory, look in the Radak, and I believe the Radak. Again, I was going to do it and I didn't have time. It's a very interesting thing. Maybe we'll even do a special shiur before Tisha B'Av. I've given this shiur before about the last years leading up to the destruction of the first temple, and we have different eduyot, right? We have different versions of it that are very closely related at the end of Melachim Bet and in Yirmiyahu, and then there's some other scattered places where we can find information. So, okay, that's what I have to say about that. So maybe longer than I wanted to speak, and I hope it was okay with everybody because it's not really pertinent to our particular share, but it may be in a more general way. Okay, with that, this is what I thought we'll do today, because we need to sort of bring ourselves back to eventually we have to get back to Yoma. And I thought the first thing I wanted to do, I sat down, I made a quick outline so that we can do this very sort of quick review of Tamid. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at the Rambam in Hilchot Tamidin and Musafim and see his summary, because it'll be a little bit more explicated than what I have. Of course, you're always encouraged to go back through the Mishnayot again, but I know that not everybody is going to take the time to do that. But let's do this quick version for ourselves, and I think it'll be helpful. So, right, Masechet Tamid Skira Klalit. So in the first parak, we learned in the beginning about Shmirat HaMikdash, right? If you remember, it starts off basically about the Leviim and where they were posted in different parts of the Beit HaMikdash, and what they would do if they had a nocturnal emission. They would go to the for Tefillah and so forth, and they were sleeping in the. It focuses on the ones who are sleeping in the Beit HaMoked and near the Beit HaMoked, and then the Mimuneh comes in, and and then he asks who wants to be Toremat HaMizbech, which is the first pais. Then they go out with their torches and they split into two groups. They go out from the Beit HaMoked into the Azara, and one group goes north and one group goes south, and then they come around and they meet close to the, it would be the south, near the southeast corner, a little bit in, like a little bit in from the southeast corner. And from there, the person who had won the pais for Trumat Hadeshin, he would go and start to do this Trumat Hadeshin. In the second parak, we learn about Sidur HaMizbeach. In other words, after he did the Trumat Hadeshin, the other Kohanim would come and sort of start to arrange everything, arrange the Ma'arachot. If you remember, there are really three Ma'arachot, there are at least three. There's actually, this is a Sugya in Yoma that we didn't see. But based on what we saw in Tamid, there were three Ma'arachot. There's one on the east, which is the largest Ma'aracha. In other words, that was the largest fire that was on the Mizbeach. And then, and that's where the Evarim, the pieces from the Korban Tamid and the other Korbanot are going to get burned. And then there was one on the west side of the Mizbeach that was a bit smaller, and that's where later on they take the coals from to do the Ktoret in the Mizbeach, for the Mizbeach HaPnimi. So they would arrange, and then there's a third one that was there just to be Mekayem, the mitzvah of always having a fire on the Mizbeach. Then they would set up Shnei Gizrei Etzim. They would set up two logs on the big Ma'aracha, right, the Ma'aracha Gedolah and the Ma'aracha Ktana. Then they would light them, make sure that they were lit, and then those Kohanim would go out to Lishkat HaGazit in order to do the second pais. So then the second pais was all of these things that I have listed here. In the Mishnah, it starts off Mishochet, and we learned back then that Shrita was actually not the pais. The pais was for Zrika, because the main mitzvah was the Zrika, to take the blood from the animal and to throw it onto the Mizbeach. But whoever was picked to do the Zrika, he would take the one next to him to do the Shrita. So this was the order that people were picked: the Zrika, Shrita, Dishun Mizbeach HaPnimi, right? Cleaning off the golden altar that's inside the Hechal, Dishun HaMenorah, cleaning the menorah, and then the different parts of the animal that would be brought up to the Mizbeach, that would be brought up to on the ramp of the Mizbeach, and that was the head and one of the legs, Shtei HaYadayim, which would be the two front paws, the Oketz, which is the rear, that would include the fatty tail and one of the other leg, Hazeh Geira, the chest, and Geira, like where the first, I think that's, what would you call that? Where they cut The what?
Gullet.
You call it a gullet in a sheep? Yeah, I guess so.
Or throat, I mean.
I think it's more than I think it's a bit more than throat, but it's in that area, right? It's connected to the chest. Shteit fanot, the two flanks, kirbayim, the innards like the intestines, and then also solot shel minchat nesachim, the flour that was used for the minchat nesachim, which was brought with the korban tamid, chavitei kohen gadol, to be brought, that the Kohen Gadol had to bring every day onto the Mizbech. Yayin, we didn't actually go into detail about these things, and we will look at them a little bit later. And Yayin Shel Nesachim, the wine that was brought for Misuch HaYayin. So after that pious, they would bring Hava'at Aleh Milishkat HaTlaim Beit HaMitbachim, Beit HaMitbachim. Sorry. So then they would bring a sheep from the pen, right? There was a special lishka in the Beit HaMikdash where they held the sheep. They would bring it over to the area where it was going to get slaughtered. And then midashen mizbeach panimi u'mizbeach midashen menorah nichnasim leichal. So based on the Mishnah, the way we see it in the Mishnah, at the time that they were getting ready to slaughter the Korban Tamid, the people who had been chosen from this second pious to clean the Mizbeach HaPanimi and to clean the menorah, they would go into the Heichal. And if you remember then, that was where we talked about there was like the wicket, and they had to reach in and, open it up in a special way and get in and so forth. That was all happening then. And Dishun Mizbeach HaPnimi. So then the first one would clean off the small Mizbeach, the Mizbeach HaPnimi that was inside the Eichal. Then Dishun Chamesh Neirot. Then the person who has the mitzvah for Dishun HaMenorah, he would do Dishun of the first five lights, which would be the westernmost lights, if we go according to the person who according to the Shita that held that the menorah was set up from going from east to west. Then they would go out from the Heichal. In the beginning of Perek Revi, it starts off with Shlitat Tamid. So we'll see in the Rambam, and I think we mentioned this at the time, the idea is that when these people went into the Heichal to do the Dishun HaMizbeach and the Dishun HaMenorah, at that time, that's when they would start to actually do the Shkita. This was more or less simultaneous. So the Tamir would get shechted, and then the blood would be captured, and right by the person who won the pious for the Zrika, Zrikat Damo Mizbeach HaChitzon, and then the blood would be sprinkled. And then after that, we went to a lot of detail on this in the Mishnah. There's the Hefshet v'Nituach of the Tamid. The Kohen, one of the Kohanim, would cut up the animal into its constituent parts that were laid out earlier. And then Holachata Kol Kavesh, all of the people who had won the pious for the different parts of the animal would take their parts and go and lay them on the ramp on the western side of the ramp halfway up. And then once again, Chozrin Lishkat Gazit Kriyat Shema Tefillah. They go back to Lishkat Gazit for. I put Kriyat Shema Tefillah Ktsara here. That's the beginning of the next chapter, and I didn't spell it right. I put Kara'it Shema. Okay, let's fix that. And you remember that this was, they first said the Aser Tadibrot, they would say Shema, and there was a kind of a truncated tefillah that was introduced at that time. Then they would do the third pious. So the third pious was for Ketoret, whoever had not done Ktoret prior to that time would be eligible for that payis. And then they would also right away do the fourth payis, which would be the payis to choose who was going to bring the limbs that have been laid out on the ramp to bring them up to the Mizbeach itself. Then at that time, the person who had won the payis for the Ktoret, he would go and get the Ktoret. The person who won, there would be a person who also won to, who would be next to him, who would be the one to bring the machtav, right, which would be the coal pan. He would go and get the coals from the outer mizbeach for the Ktoret. Then Zrikata Magrefa. So then one of the Kohanim would throw this Magrefa, and here the Magrefa we're talking about was this some kind of an instrument that when you threw it, it made an enormous sound, and that was a way of notifying people to do different things. At that time, it would notify the Kohanim they should run to the Azara. If they weren't already in the Azara, they should run to the Azara to bow, which we'll see a little bit later. The Leviim should go and stand in place to do the shir, to do the song. And then we had this statement that said, Rosh HaMa'amad Ma'amida Tmeim B'Shar HaMizrach. The head of the Ma'amad, which was the group of Yisraelim who would be on duty in the Beit HaMikdash to represent Klal Yisrael, the head of that Ma'amad would stand up the Tmeim in the eastern gate, and there were different interpretations of what that meant. But for our purposes, we'll just leave it at that. So then we have Aliyat Kohanim al Ma'alot Ha'olam. The Kohanim then, they run in, and now they're standing on the steps that go up to the Ulam. So they're essentially between the Ulam, right, which is sort of the anteroom that goes before the Hekal. In other words, they're outside the temple proper, on the stairs leading up, and the person who had done the Dishun HaMizbeach HaPnimi, he would go in and remove the teni, which was the plea that was used to gather the ash that he left in there earlier. And then the person who had been there to do the Dishun HaMenorah, he only did the first 5 neirots, and then he goes in to do the last 2 neirots. And then Hotzat HaKuz Me'echal, he would take out the kuz, which was this kind of pitcher, which was used to take the ash and the burnt wicks and so forth out. They would remove those from the Hechal. So at that point, the person who had the coals in the machta, in the coal pan, from the outer mizbeach, he would go in and he would arrange the coals on the mizbeach hapnimi, which is the mizbeach haktoret, and then azoche b'ktoret maktir haktoret, right? And then the person who's going to do the ktoret, he would bring the ktoret at that point. And just to remind you, I didn't put it here, but just to remind you, at that moment, everybody else would leave. Only that kohen could be in the hechal at that time. Then the Mishnah in the last chapter, it shifted a bit, and it talked about in the beginning of the chapter, Din Kohen Gadol Shirotzel Yishtachavot Be'echal. In other words, this seemed to be an option that at this point, if the Kohen Gadol wanted to, he could go in to bow down in the Hechal, and then come out and join the other Kohanim who would be on the stairs of the Mizbeach, and then they would all do Birkat Kohanim. Then it brought the, it said that if the Kohen Gadol wanted, he could bring all of the Evarim onto the Mizbeach. So it talked about that, and Haktarat Evarim and Nesachim, and then it described how they would be brought up, that whoever had won the pious for those particular pieces, they would come up, and there would be this this little ceremony where Kohen would do smicha on them and then throw them in, or he could have the mimunetra, or the first one throw them in and so forth. But that would be the time when the actual limbs are going to be burning, to be put on the mizbeach to be burnt. And then the Levim would sing. That's a very quick summary of what we spent a number of weeks on. Okay, to put this in a little bit more context, let's look at the Rambam. Wait a second. For those of you who are interested, this should not be that difficult, especially having done what we've done. This is the Rambam in Hilchot Tamidin Umusafin, and he goes through in the first few chapters. He describes the mitzvot that took place in the Beit HaMikdash. So we're not going to go through all of these things now. Some of the source material for what he says here comes from our Mishnah. A lot of it actually comes from our Mishnah and Tamid. Some of it comes from Yoma. Some of it from other sources in the Gemara. But he starts it right. So this is Tamidin and Musafin. So basically, the Rambam is going to lay out in these halachot the laws of bringing the Korban Tamid and the laws of bringing the Korbanot Musaf. So he starts off by saying there's a mitzvah to bring tukvasim, olot every day, and then he talks about some of the particular aspects when you have to shecht them, and how that fits in if you have to shecht also the Korban Pesach, which do you do when, and so forth. That's the first chapter. The second chapter, he talks about the idea that you have to have the fire burning on the Mizbeach all the time. And here he goes into some of the detail about how the Ma'arachot were set up, the mitzvah of Shnei Gzarim Shel, right, and the Shnei Gzarim of the Maracha. And here he also mentions some things that were done in Bein HaArbaim. And he talks about how many Ma'arachot there are. And here also he talks about how Trumat HaDeshen was done. He adds that in here because it has to do with the Mizbeach and the Ma'arachot. The third chapter, he talks about Haktarat Aktoret and the Dishun Hamnorah, right? So those, right, because we see from the way this is brought in the Mishnah that these two things are paired. The Dishun Mizbeach HaPnimi, which is done in anticipation of Haktarat Aktoret, and the Dishun HaMenorah, which is done in anticipation of the lighting of the menorah. So here he talks about all of that. And this is the Rambam Shita, and I think this we probably will come back to when we look at the details of the lighting of the menorah. Here
Shel?
Yes.
Just a remark. When I see all these mitzvot which you do in the Beit HaMikdash, they are extremely precise. You have got, I think I already said something like this. You have to be extremely precise, everything in order, and also the quantities and so on. And it seems to me, it's actually an impression that the halakha, Chazal's halakha is also extremely precise. You want to be as precise as you can. And maybe they try to imitate the avodah in the Bet HaMikdash by the precision, insisting on this precision of the halakha.
So your comment is what? Do you think? I'm not. So are you implying that the precision was something that was added in at a later time by Chazal?
No, Chazal, they added many mitzvot which the avodah after the temple didn't exist anymore. It was completely different from the avodah which was before. There were some things, but you know, it's another. It's almost another religion. What Chazal created, yes, and they developed this halakha. This halakha is again extremely precise.
I'll just put that some of the earliest Mishnayot that we have to do with testimony from people who were actually in the Beit HaMikdash.
Yes, of course, but afterwards it was developed into something completely different. They had no choices, but...
No, when you say that it was made into something completely... Here, okay. After the destruction of the temple, so we no longer have the avodah in the Beit HaMikdash. Everybody knows that. So but I'm not sure it's interesting because I was listening to a podcast about this recently. I also wasn't sure that I agreed with them. I'm not sure that it was completely different because the idea that tefillah existed in a form that's somewhat like it served as the basis for the tefillah that became widespread. We see that already took place in the time of the temple. Now, I don't know exactly what time all of the tefillot are introduced, but those things are there, right? In other words, the idea of saying Kriyat Shema is there. According to Chazal, the institution of the Amidah goes back to the beginning of the Second Temple. So some things do survive. But when your emphasis on this idea that everything is very precise, yeah, but I'm not sure what point you're making by that. I'm not sure what you're trying to bring up by emphasizing how precise these things are.
Well, you have other religions where people are much more free to do what they want to do. The Jews, they have a very a code which they have. If you follow all this, at each moment you have to do something according to the halakha. In the morning you have to put that shoe and the other shoe, and the straps here and the straps there. So this is something which you wouldn't find, I think so, in other places.
Well, that's an interesting point. I will just point out, I think it's true that Jews, going back to the Torah itself, we have a lot of very precise halachot that, in the form of mitzvot that are given to us in the Torah, right? We've talked about this also. Just a simple reading of the Torah shows us that there's this enormous emphasis on the avodah in the Beit HaMikdash, the building of the Mishkan, the avodah in the Beit HaMikdash,
Yes.
and Tahara, right? And like the Mishnah says in the end of Chagigah, there's some mitzvot like the halachot of Shabbat, which are like harim tuyim b'seyah, the mountains that are hanging by a thread, right? Because the Torah only gives us like a few psukim about Shabbat, and here we have, hundreds and hundreds of halachot that have to do with Shabbat. But it's true, when you talk about all these things of avodah in the Mishkan, building the Mishkan, the Tuman Tara, Torah has an enormous amount of instruction. Very, very, at least it's seemingly very precise. We know from actually learning it, it's sometimes hard to understand, and that's where we get into machlakot and so forth, but there's an enormous amount of material to work with. I'll just point out, I'm not by any means an expert in other, in other contemporaneous religions, but I will point out that when you learn Masechet Avodah Zarah in some other places in Shas, we do understand that the other nations, they had their own halachot, which were important to them. To what degree, I think your point is probably still well taken, that maybe they were not as many, maybe they were not as precise, but I think
the Christians have 7 I don't know how to say in English,
Sacraments.
Sacraments. They have these 7. That's what they have to do.
Only the Catholics. Sorry, only the Catholics. Protestants only 2.
Okay, I know. I come from a country where all the people were Catholics.
So you're right.
If
On
you
the other
remember,
hand,
go ahead, Michael.
I mean, I can't claim any particular expertise in Christianity, but I mean, as I recall, I mean, there is in fact, within those 7 sacraments, there is an incredible density of instruction. And then you have the saints' days, you have the books of hours, you have, I mean, it is in fact, I think, there are different levels of observance, but there is an incredible density, as I understand it.
I'll just go back to the time of when the competing religions were religions of Avodah Zarah. So I think maybe you all know the story from the Gemara in Gittin about the destruction of the Second Temple, the story of Kamtzu Bar Kamtza. And if you remember that story of Kamtzu Bar Kamtza, you remember what happens is that he goes to the Roman governor to say that the Jews are revolting against you and I'm going to prove it. Send a korban with me and you'll see that they won't bring it. And so what does he do on the way? He takes the korban, he takes the animal, he gives it a mum, right? The Gemara says he gives it a mum that was a mum for the Jews, but not for the Romans. So I'm just bringing that as an example. In other words, the Romans wouldn't sacrifice anything. They also had this idea that you're not allowed to sacrifice an animal with a mum, but they had their own set of whatever those mumim were. When you learn Masechet Avodah Zarah, you learn about the different kinds of idol worship that existed at the time that Chazal were talking about. They talk about how different things were worshipped. You had to worship them in a certain way. And so as Jews, you had to be careful, not to defecate in front of Marcolis, because that was the way that was the avodah that was done. Defecation was part of the avodah. So they had their rules. However, I don't know, but I think what you're saying though is generally true. We have a lot of rules. We have a lot of mitzvot. We have a lot of rules. We have a lot of precision, and I think it's worth pointing out. These things are very important to us, and I guess one of the things that we do in this class, and that Jews have been doing for the last couple of thousand years since the Churban Bayit Sheni, is since we don't actually get to do these things, we don't actually get to experience them, we learn about them, and we try to vicariously have that experience through this learning, and then try to figure out what the deeper meaning is. In other words, we go into this with the idea that all of these rules are not arbitrary, but they have some deeper meaning. Shira, did you want to say something?
Perhaps Toward Paul, I want to recommend you. So last week I studied with my teacher this introduction to Truma, written by Ramban, and you can see this introduction is a very, very rich text, so rich, and you can see that the temple, the Mishkan, is not only in a mechanism or a medium or something like that. It's come from the heart of the covenant. So to explain the Ramban, so he connected, he joined very, very deep Matan Torah, like a Giur for all Bnei Israel, being Jews after making Giur, so by Matan Torah, and then immediately Batchila. So firstly, the temple Truma comes up. So he wanted to connect the covenant and the Giur, being Jew, and the temple. And so the problem is, what is after destruction of the Mishkan remaining to rest the core of the heart of being a Jew. So that is a problem, and I can only recommend you to study this introduction to Truma, because it was I was so surprised, and it was the first reading lecture for me to depict and to decipher and to discover the meaning of the Mishkan in a enlarged and a richer manner. So sorry for my yeah, that's so not to see the temple as a mechanism or as an institution. No. You must connect it with the covenant and with the inner depth of the covenant, being the relationship between Hashem and Am Yisrael. So it's a very great text. You know it all, perhaps, and if no, study it. The introduction of Truma, so you know. So the problem is he is putting on side all the Mishpatim and connected Matan Torah and the revelation situation of Sinai, and immediately Batchila, the Mishkan. And then it's very clear what is what Paul said. What is the our motivation to study all this law halachot concerning and related to the Mishkan? Perhaps.
I missed a little bit of what you said at the very end. So, but I would just want to clarify. This is the Ramban Nachmanides.
So first, Judaism is a religion of halachot, of observance. That's very clear. But the second dimension of the question of Paul, I understood, is why are we so interested and connected with the halachot of the Mishkan? And my answer was, study the Ramban, the introduction to the Parashat Truma, and discover this amazing reasoning that Mishkan is the core and the depths of the covenant, the relationship between Hashem and Am Yisrael. It's more and more than a mechanism or a remedium like Rashi against the sin of Egel or something like that. That's you can't understand Judaism without the Mishkan. So.
Right. Actually, also there's the Ramban's short. He has a short introduction to Sefer Shemot, where right, and he describes Sefer Shemot as the Sefer Geula. So it begins with the enslavement of the Jewish people, and then Yetziat Mitzrayim. But it culminates with it culminates with the building of the Mishkan, right? And so you have the Yerida to Mitzrayim, Avdut, then you have the Geula, then you have Matan Torah, and then ultimately you get the Mishkan. And the real Dema is when you bring all of that into Eretz Yisrael, but that doesn't happen, of course, until after the time of Moshe. But yes, in other words, the idea of Geula is not just that we left Egypt, it's that we left Egypt in order to get the Torah and to build the Mishkan and have a place for the Shekhinah to dwell among us. Just leaving Egypt itself, right? When we say Dayenu, that's part of the idea of Dayenu. Like for us, it would have been enough, but that wasn't the point. The point was that Hashem wanted us to reach the point where not only we get the Torah, but we also have a Beit HaMikdash. And all of those things. So like I say, nowadays, when we study these things, and I think one of the things that Paul alluded to at the very beginning of what he said, is that yes, after the destruction of the temple, when the Jewish world is in disarray, the Jewish world such as we know it is in disarray, because everything was really centered around the temple, but in a way, the Rabbanim, in a sense, were already ready, because they had already adopted for generations this idea that the real essential aspect, the real essential aspects of the religion are davening and learning. So of course they would also, they also want davening to be centered around the temple. But if you don't have a temple, you can still daven. And learning is still, it becomes very central. So one of the things that happens is that all of the precision that Paul mentions and that Shiraz, trying to also bring into context, I think they take these details take on a greater weight, as it were. They have like a great, because now that's all we have. All we have from the service of the temple are these halachot. And like I said before, when we learn them, that's our way of vicariously, that's our vicarious experience, is through learning. So the deeper, the better we can understand how things, the mechanics of how things happen, then the better. And I think it's also true. I think to whatever degree other religions, other, the Odeh Avodah Zarah, they did have, clearly they had their Tkasim, they had their Pulchan, they had their very, they had their own precision. But one of the things that happened is those things were, those concepts were held by an elite, their priest, their priestly sect. And when those, as those peoples were conquered and exiled, those things were lost. And that's what I mean, like for us, what happened is in Judaism is that the rabbis had already long understood, like the rabbis and the Prushim before them. I'm not saying that the Sadukim also had a concept of this, but just I think in a different way. There was something very central to the idea of learning, which we see in the Torah itself. The Torah itself presents itself to us in this way. Anyway, very interesting discussion.
If I could jump in really quickly, it's a quick question.
Sure, jump.
So I mean, when we're talking about at the end of Shemot, or the construction of the Mizbeach, or the destruction of the
Mishkan.
Mishkan, that's my I'm sorry, I'm foggy at this time. As being sort of the culmination. I mean, how do we square that with, say, comments like that of the Sforno, which say that, well, no, in fact, all we're really supposed to have and all we're supposed to need was, in fact, the Mizbeach Adama. And that it's only after Heta Egel that we get these other kinds of, detailed instructions as a kind of tikkun for Heta Egel.
You know what? That's a good question. It's actually not only from the Sforno. There are other commentators that try to deal with this question. So I'm not going to try to give you an answer except to say that I think that just based on Pshuto Shel Mikra, this is not going to be a satisfactory answer for you. I think Pshuto Shel Mikra is that the Mishkan was going to be built all along, and the idea, even the idea of having the Mizbeach Adama and so forth. There is this idea that what we're trying to do, we're trying to have a place for the Shekhinah to dwell among us. And one of the other points which we've made, I'm sure, many times in this class before, and this is what we see from Sefer Bamidbar very well. All of these things, the building of the Mishkan and the way the Machaneh Yisrael is set up, all of this is a reenactment of Ma'amad Har Sinai. Ma'amad Har Sinai is the real focal point, right? This is when Hashem reveals himself to the entire nation and intervenes, as it were, in history into the entire nation, not just to Moshe, not just to one person, not just to an elite, but to everyone. And the way Ma'amad Har Sinai is described, where there's a center, and then there's something around the center, and then there's something around that, right? The Machane Yisrael is all around that. And then you have like the Zkenim and Aaron and so forth, and then you have Moshe. This is all replicated by having a Mishkan and having Machane Yisrael. And later on, it's replicated to a similar degree in when you have the Beit HaMikdash. So the main idea, the main concept, and Rishonim talk about this, but I think this is also something that you get just from a straight reading of the Torah, is that the focal point is Ma'amad Har Sinai, because this is when Hashem reveals himself directly to all the people. And then after that, Hashem puts in place a mechanism through the Mishkan and through Machane Israel and through the Beit HaMikdash later on, where there will always be a dwelling place of Hashem amongst the people. So I think that's something that's inevitable. That this is something that's a very basic part. It's an integral part to this idea of having the Mishkan, and the idea that you have to have a place for the Shekhinah to dwell. And of course, the crisis is what happens when you no longer have a Beit HaMikdash. And so then, yes, then we have we have all these other things, we have the Mikdash Ma'at, we have the idea of the Beit Knesset, and we retain these other aspects in anticipation of the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash, however you understand that. But it's not a full answer to your question. The Sforno is very interesting in that way, and there are other people who make similar kinds of things. I think the Sforno is very forward in a sense. But there are also midrashim that go in a similar kind of vein. So maybe another time. But I'm glad you asked the question. That's the best I can answer. I think that Hashem wanted some replication of Ma'amad Har Sinai to exist, so that would not be just a one-time event, but it would be an ongoing participation of the people with the Shekhinah.
Of course, an argument could be made that the Mizbech Adama, in fact, is a reenactment. And in some sense, it's closer to the Ikar than the more elaborate.
Yes. Well, so yes and no. In other words, I think, okay, if you want Bili Neder, I'll try to prepare something about this, right? So the Mizbech has other important connotations, right? Because we have a Mizbech going back already to the time of Cain Behevel. We have Noach. We have all of the Avot, and we have the Akedah, which of course is a special Mizbech. And so, but and according to the way you understand, the placement of the Mizbech was also ekroni. It was also an important part of this discussion. Shira, I see you leaning forward.
Sorry.
Please, now jump in. Go ahead. This is becoming a more freely discussion, but that's fine. Go.
Only one point. Sorry, against Michael. Sorry. So the Mizbeach.
You're forgiven.
The Mizbeach made of earth. It's not a place for the ark. So the point is we need a room, the Kodesh Kodashim, for the ark with Cherubim and the dwelling place for the Shekhinah. And the Mizbeach firmament mentions not perhaps holy enough or not a good environment. What is the idea of permanent institution, making permanent the experience of the revelation on the Mount Sinai. That's the point. So we need this Kodesh Kodashim, and we need the Edut and all these things. And this Be'er is not enough. It's not it's not enough for this idea and to realize the implication of a dwelling place for Shekhinah in the void between these two cherubim. So, okay, that's one of my arguments against Michael. But
So-
except that Hakadosh Baruch Hu says that he says I will dwell betocham.
Nachon.
yeah, but what does he say right before that?
Build me a mizbeach. Yes, but I so in some sense that
So
there
he
is
says, "Asita li mikdash, make for me a mikdash, v'shachanti betocha."
but it doesn't say here. He says, "Build a mikdash that I will dwell among you." So I mean, but he says
Among them, betocham.
Tocham. So,
Yeah.
but I think there is a kind of tension there between, on the one hand, having the place where the centralized place, but then this kind of like also sort of radically kind of decentralized vision as well. So I mean, I think you have both. They're contradictory, but they coincide.
So when you say radically decentralized, what are you referring to? To the time after the destruction of the temple?
No, I'm referring to the Beit Tocham. I mean, he doesn't say
Okay, no, but
Beit
okay.
Tocham.
So I think the simple understanding of that is that in order for me to dwell among all of the people, there has to be a central location. There has to be a mikdash. The Asita li mikdash, in order that I can be shochen betocham, in order that I can dwell amongst them. So without the mikdash, there is no shechina betocham. That's I think the simple reading of that pasuk. So it's not that you have one or the other, or one represents a concentration, the other one is this is like more spread out or is decentralized. The one is talui on the other. You need one to do the other, and that's in fact why when the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, that's why there is such a crisis. Because how can you have the Shekhinah dwell anywhere if there's no Mikdash? And so we saw from other shiurim, so Chazal also fill in that void by saying, no, the Shekhinah can dwell with 10 people and with 9 people and with 8 people and with 2 people and with 3 people. And they have just showed through all of these things that the Shekhinah itself still lives on among us. But we understand from the Torah that the ideal is that the Shekhinah dwells among us, ideally through the reality of having a mikdash. When Hashem gives the luchot to Moshe Rabbeinu, and then those luchot are placed in the Aron, in the Kodesh HaKodeshim. So here, this is something actually we do know from ancient archaeology. The way the temple was built, the way the Mishkan was set up, and then later on the way the temple was built, was very much parallel to the way Ovdei Avodah Zarah also built their temples. But what did they have in their Kodesh HaKodeshim? They had their main idol. They had their pesel. They had that, right, which for them represented their particular God. So we don't have that. What do we have? We have the Luchot, and we have a Sefer Torah. Those are the things, because Hashem is Ein Lo Guf, and Hashem expresses himself, he expressed himself to us and revealed himself to us through his Torah, through the word of the Torah. So that's our Kodesh HaKodeshim, that's our representation of that which is ultimate, like the highest holiness, because it represents God himself. That's what we have instead of Kivyachol, that's instead of a pesel. We have Hashem's. This is how Hashem told us he is representing himself to us. And so so Chazal, I think, understood that on this deeper level, that even if we are no longer in that same place, and even if we no longer have that same building, and even if we no longer are able to perform all the things that we're learning about now, but what was the main thing? The main thing was Hitgalut Bahar Sinai, the revelation of the Torah to Am Yisrael, and that was the holiest point of the temple, which was the holiest point in the physical world. And we will take from that and, bring it with us wherever we go. That was this is the basic message of Chazal. This was the basis for them being able to continue on without the temple. That's how I see it. So this was a very interesting digression, which I think we'll come back to, because a lot of these things are things that are going to come up. The other thing I will say, Michael, I've only done a very cursory reading of the Sforno. And, but I do know.
Probably less cursory than.
But you know what, maybe at some point we will come back to some of these things. But it's fine. I think for now, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I was just summarizing the Rambam here in the 4th chapter. He goes to the Paisot. In the 5th chapter, he talks about the Lechem HaPanim, which we didn't talk about at all, and we will come back to it eventually, even though it's not as pertinent. But here, for the last part of the shiur, I'm going to read through most of this. Well, let's just look at this together. This is the Rambam's quick summary. What I tried to do in my outline of Masechet Tamid. The Rambam, of course, brings the halacha in a little bit more detail, and this will be a good summary, a good way for us to remember the things that have been going on. So he says here in this 6th chapter, Seder avodot hatmidot b'chol yom kachu. So the reason I did this quick summary of the first few chapters is because the Rambam in those chapters goes into some detail about how different mitzvot were done, how the shlita was done, or how the Trumat HaDeshen was done, and so on and so forth. And here he's just going to put everything in order. Seder avodot hatmidot b'chol yom kachu. Samuch la'alot hashachar yavo mimuneh shel al hapiasot v'yakish al hazarel potchim lo. Right. So the mimuneh, the one who's in charge of doing the payasot, he comes, he knocks on the door, they open for him. Umevalshin kol ha'azara, they go and they examine the entire azara, like we talked about. Amamidin oseh chavitin lasot hachavitin. Because where they all end up when they go around the Azara, they all end up at the Lishkat HaChavitin, and then they get the Kohanim starting making the Kohen Gadol's Chavitin. These people had already tabled and already are wearing their bigdei kuna. So then they go to the Lishkat HaGazit, v'yafisu payis rishon v'sheni, v'yizkeh kol echad b'mlachto k'mo shebe'ernu. Now the order the Rambam's reading this here seems to be a little bit different than what we saw in the Mishnah, because there was an implication that the first payis, which is for Trumat HaDeshen, was already done before they went and examined the whole Azara. But there's some discussion about this. For right now, we're just going to go with the way the Rambam brings it down. And the second payis, which he described in chapter 5, is the payis which is mostly the different, it's the people who are going to do the Dishun HaMizbeach HaPnimi and the Dishun HaMenorah, and bring the different parts, the Shlita and so forth, all the parts of the animal that have to be brought for the Korban Tamid. Right? They do the big fire on the Mizbeach, which is the smaller fire on the west side. That's when they bring in the 2 big logs. They put them on the maracha to make the fire big. Right? I left that out of my outline, but that's at that point they go and they take out all the kelim. I think it says they're 92 kelim. It's not exactly sure what the number represents and so forth, but that's what they take out the kelim they need for the whole day. Mashkina tamid mayim, they give the tamid water. The person who is zocha in his shlita, in the shlita of the tamid, brings it over to the place which is in the northern part of the Azara, north of the Mizbeach, to slaughter it. Right, all the other kohanim who won the pious to bring the different parts of the animal onto the Mizbeach go after him. They wait there until the gate to the Heichal Hagadol is open, and who opens it? Those are the people who are going to go in to do the Dishun Mizbeach HaPanimi and the Dishun of Norah. Everybody can hear that. If you remember, the Mishnah says that you could hear the opening of the Shar in Yericho, like it was a big deal to hear. So that was the signal for the people who are holding the Taleh for the Korban Tamid to start their work, knowing that the people who are going in to get the things ready inside the Heichal are going in. So then, right, those two Kohanim go in. The one who is going to do the Dishun Mizbeach, the one who's going to do Dishun Norah. So the one who does Dishun Mizbeach, he's doing the Dishun Mizbeach at the time that the Korban Tamid is being shechted. By the way, this thing which we mentioned at the time that we learned, and I brought it up now, in the outline in here. This is something that actually I've always been kind of fascinated with, that there was this coordination, right? Because these people can't see each other. The people who are inside the Heichal obviously can't see the people who are north of the Mizbeach who are about to shech the Korban Tamid. But it seems what we understand is it's important in principle that those two things are being done simultaneously, that the Korban Tamid is being shechted at the same time that the Mizbeach HaPnimi is being cleaned. Now, I don't know exactly what the connection is, and because we're late on time here, everybody can think about that. If you have a good idea, let me know next time. I have some ideas, but I just want to point out that there is this idea that there's certain things that are supposed to be happening inside and outside simultaneously. Right, so then the guy who has to do Dishun HaMenorah, he does the first 5 Neirot. Then the people who are outside in the place where they're doing the slaughtering, they strip and cut up the parts of the animal, and they give each part of the animal to each person that needs to take it up to the Mizbeach. And here, this wasn't in our Mishnah, but the Rambam adds in, V'shel Musafin, right, so the Evarim that for the Korban Tamid, it did say in the Mishnah, those are brought up halfway up the ramp, up to halfway on the ramp on the west side. If it's a day where they also have to bring parts for the Korban Musaf, they would put those up to halfway on the east side, V'shel Roshei Chodeshim. Let's say there was also, let's say it was Rosh Chodesh, those Nina al Mizbeach Nilamala Ben Karen, the Karen Bimkom Hiluch Reglei HaKohanim. Those would actually be put all the way up on the top of the Mizbeach, where there's the width of an Amah where the Kohanim can walk around between the different corners. And so those would be higher up. It's actually another 5 amot up. They would be in more public display, so everybody knows it's Rosh Chodesh. Molchin shamet ha'evarim, and they would salt the pieces there. V'zorkin melech al gabei hakevesh afilu b'Shabbat. They would sprinkle salt on the kevesh so that the Kohanim are not going to slip and fall when they're going up there. When they bring up the wood to the ma'aracha. And the Rambam points out, even though the salt itself is actually a chatzitza, right? It separates between the foot of the Kohen and the ramp. And we learned before that the Kohanim, like their feet, there should be no chatzitza between their foot and the Beit HaMikdash, not the floor of the Beit HaMikdash, not the ramp. So why do we allow them to put the salt on the ramp? Bringing the Evarim in this fashion onto the Mizbeach is not technically an avodah, and so they're allowed to have their feet, have some salt on their feet when they're on the ramp, bringing up the the pieces. Because of course we're also concerned that the main concern is that we don't want them to slip and fall. And everybody goes into Lishkat HaGazit, and this is where they do their short davening. On Shabbat, they would add another bracha, and they would say, I think we mentioned this also on Shem Mishmar, Yotzei on Shem Mishmar Nichnas. Misha Shikein, they would say this extra bracha, Misha Shikein and Shmo B'bayit Hazeh Yashkin Beinechem Ahava Achva Shalom V'Reut. They would essentially bless the outgoing Mishmar blesses the incoming Mishmar, that everybody should dwell here in peace and brotherhood. So, Zoche B'Ktoret, Misha Zachar. So the third pais is for the Ktoret, and he goes in to do the Haktarat Ktoret. V'chakach Nichnas Zeh Zacha B'Dishun HaMenorah Mitiv Shtei HaNeirot. The person who won Dishun HaMenorah, he goes in now to do the last two Neirot. Yotzei Zeh She'iktir Midashen HaMenorah. And then they go out together. V'yomer HaMa'alot HaOlam Hu V'yachav HaKohanim. Tishiagia bein ha'ulam v'lamizbeach, when he comes to be in between the ulam and the mizbeach, and they're on the stairs that are then natal echad ha'magrefa uzraka bein ha'ulam v'mizbeach. One of them takes this magrefa, he throws it between the ulam and the mizbeach, and it made a big noise, and it indicated three things. Whoever heard the sound of it knew that his brothers, the Kohanim, are going to bow down, and he would come, run and come. If he was a Ben Levi that heard it, he knew that the Levite brothers are going in to say the shir, and he comes. And Rosh HaMa'amad, Kshaya Shomei et Kolo, Haya Ma'amid et HaTamim al Sha'ar HaMizrach, B'nei HaChashad, because of suspicion. She'edu HaKol Shadayin Lo Hibiu Kaparatan. So the Rambam here is understanding these are Tmeim who still need to bring a korban for their final kapara. So those are the Tmeim according to the Rambam that are being spoken about here. Some other people say it was the Tmeim are actually, all right, we'll just leave it at that. You can look back in the Bartanur. He brings the other Perushim. Okay, so then at this point, the people who won the pious for bringing which was the fourth pious, who won the fourth pious to bring the Evarim from the ramp onto the Mizbeach. So here in the Mishnah, what it did at this point, it talked about if the Kohen Gadol wanted to bring them, and the Rambam is just saying, okay, but if the Kohen Gadol didn't want to bring them, then the people who won the pious to bring them would bring them. They would go onto the Mizbeach. All of the Evarim, let's say on a regular day, have been stacked on the lower half up to half of the west side of the Kavesh, and they would go in the order that they were supposed to go in and take their Evarim and put them onto the Ma'aracha. So once all of the Evarim are on the Mizbeach, Matchilin Elu Sh'al Ma'alot Ha'olam, Mavachim Birkat Kohanim Bracha Achat B'Shem HaMeforash, Kamo Shebe'erna B'Mkoma. So at this point, the Kohanim who were standing on the Ma'alot Ha'olam that we mentioned before, they would do Birkat Kohanim. After that, they would bring the meal offering, Yachaso and Maktir HaChavitin. Then that would be the Chavitin of the Kohen Gadol that would be brought. Yachar Chavitin Ma'alin et Hayayin L'Nisuf. And then the last thing that would be brought would be the wine libation. Vishat HaNisuf, Omrin HaLeviim HaShir. That's when the Leviim would say their shir. Makin HaMashorim B'minei Nigun, and the singers would also be playing their instruments, should be mikdash of tokin teisha tikiyot al pirkei hashir, and they would blow 9 blasts on the different parts of the shir. Yeah, let's read a little bit more because we didn't actually cover this, but just to give a fuller picture. So again, in our Mishnah, it talked about the Kohen Gadol doing it, but if it wasn't the Kohen Gadol, it would be one of the regular Kohanim. They would give the wine to the person who's going to put it. And if you remember, he pours the wine into the horn that's coming up on the southwest corner, and there were two holes in it. One was narrow and one was wide. One was for the water libation, one was for the wine libation. The wine libation was thicker because the wine was wider, so because the wine was thicker. And on a day that you would do both, you want them to both go down at the same rate. Anyway, so they would give him the wine. So remember, we saw this, I didn't bring it up today, but there are two shulchanot that are below, in between the ulam and the mizbeach, that are below this southwest corner. One of them is called the Shulchan HaChalavim, where they would lay out the fat, and they would have two trumpets. Vasgan omeid al keren hamizbeach, vasudarin biyado. Right. This is brought in the last chapter of Tamid. The skan is standing on the corner of the mizbeach, and he has these sudarin, right? These like scarves, these pieces of brightly colored cloth. V'taku v'heriu v'taku. So the people with the chatzatzrot would do these blasts, kiyatruat kiyah. Ubal v'yamdu etzel zehem mimuneh ahatziltzal. Then the guy who's with the tziltzal, which is probably some kind of symbol, echad mimino v'echad mismado. V'shahar menasech lanesech menif haskan b'sudarin. Sorry, the person who's doing the nisuch is Shahar. He's waiting. The skan waves his sudarin. The one who has the symbol strikes the symbol. V'taku el b'chatzutrot v'dabru halavim b'shir, and that would signal for the Levim to start singing. Higi leperek, when they would finish one perek, then taku yishtachavu kol ha'am sheba'azara. Then there would be a tkiyah. Everybody who's in the Azara would bow down. Al kol perek tkiyah, al kol tkiyah ishtachavaya. At the end of each section of song, there would be a tkiyah, and then there would be everybody bowing down. L'chol hatkiyot she'al hatamid teisha. There would be a total of 9 of these tkiyot for the Korban Tamid. Ein omrim shira el alot hatzibur v'zivchei shalmehem ha'amurim b'Torah. The only time shira was said would be for alot hatzibur, like the Korban Tamid, and zivchei shalmehem, also for the tzibur, that are said in the Torah. Aval alot nidava, voluntary olot that were brought, shemakrivi mimotar trumata lishka, that if they, at the end of the year, when they would have money left over in where the money was gathered up in the temple, so they would bring extra korbanot olot nidava from the tzibur, afal pi shehein shel tzibur, even though those come from the tzibur, ein omrin shira aleihem, because they were not fixed in the same way. V'chein nesachin aba'im b'fnei atzman, ein omrin aleihem shira. Right, so this is right, and this is the sugya I mentioned to you from Arachin. This is where this is discussed, and this is where it's decided. And then the Rambam brings the shirim shel yom for every day and for the chagim, and I think that's a good place to stop. Okay. Any last? Oh, I think we lost Paul. Any last questions or comments? No. Okay, well, thank you for coming, and it was a very interesting discussion. And like I say, I think we'll get back to some of these points again. So thank you all for bringing them up, and Bezrat Hashem, see you next week.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.